In Millbrook, Maine, 75-year-old Emily Jackson was about to discover her children saw her as a burden to manage. What started as a birthday celebration turned shocking when they presented nursing home brochures and ultimatums about her realistic living arrangements. Emily Jackson wasn't your typical widow. For 40 years as head librarian, she'd been known for her sharp mind and fierce independence, maintaining her Victorian home with meticulous care. Her response, signing over her $800,000 property deed to Marcus Rivera, the 19-year-old who showed genuine care, would redefine family inheritance forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Emily Jackson's Victorian house, casting familiar patterns across the hardwood floors she'd polished just yesterday. At 75, she still rose with the sun, her internal clock as precise as the grandfather clock that chimed in the hallway, a wedding gift from Harold that had marked every significant moment of their 45-year marriage. Emily moved through her morning routine with the efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of living alone. Coffee first, dark and strong, then out to the garden where the late September roses still bloomed, despite the coastal Maine chill. She deadheaded the spent flowers with practiced precision, her arthritis barely noticeable in her steady hands. The neighbors' houses remained dark and quiet, their occupants still sleeping off the weekend. But Emily had always preferred these solitary hours, when Millbrook belonged entirely to her. "Looking good, Mrs. Jackson," the voice carried across her white picket fence, warm with genuine affection rather than the careful politeness she'd grown accustomed to from most young people. Marcus Rivera approached with 2 grocery bags balanced easily in his arms, his work boots crunching softly on the shell-lined path that led to her back door. "You're early today," Emily observed, setting down her pruning shears to accept the bags. At 19, Marcus possessed the kind of quiet competence that reminded her of Harold at that age. Purposeful movement, eyes that actually saw what needed doing, the absence of that restless energy that seemed to plague most of his generation. "Figured I'd get your shopping done before the birthday crowd arrives," Marcus replied, following her into the kitchen that still smelled faintly of the cinnamon rolls she'd baked yesterday. "Maya wanted me to give you this." He pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket, the paper clearly chosen with care, deep blue with silver stars, the kind of attention to detail that spoke of genuine thought rather than obligation. Emily recognized Maya's artistic touch in the precise folds and careful ribbon work. "That girl spends too much money on gifts," Emily said, though her voice carried affection rather than criticism. "How are the college applications coming along?" "She's working on the essays tonight. Says the one about overcoming challenges is giving her trouble." Marcus began unpacking groceries with the familiarity of someone who'd performed this task dozens of times, placing items exactly where Emily preferred them without needing instruction. "I keep telling her she's overcome more than most adults, but she doesn't see it that way." Emily watched him work, noting the threadbare edges of his jacket, the careful way he handled the more expensive items, as if their cost made them fragile. His grocery choices reflected the same practical mindset she recognized in herself: quality where it mattered, economy everywhere else, nothing wasted. "The house looks perfect, as always," Marcus continued, glancing around the kitchen with its cheerful yellow walls and the collection of ceramic roosters that had accumulated over decades. "Your family's lucky to have such a nice place to celebrate." Something in his tone caught Emily's attention, not envy exactly, but the wistful quality of someone who had never taken family gatherings for granted. She'd learned pieces of his story over the past 2 years, fragments shared during grocery deliveries and yard work sessions. Parents lost in a car accident 3 years ago. A younger sister to raise. 3 jobs to pay for community college while living in the tiny apartment above Morrison's Hardware. "They'll be here around 4, Emily said, though something in her voice suggested less enthusiasm than the words implied. "Patricia insisted on coordinating everything. Says I shouldn't worry about hosting at my age." Marcus paused in his unpacking, his hands stilling on a package of Emily's preferred tea. Years of reading people's faces, a survival skill learned early in his abbreviated childhood, had taught him to recognize the spaces between words where real meaning lived. "I should probably head out before they arrive," he said diplomatically. "Don't want to intrude on family time." "You wouldn't be intruding." The words came out sharper than Emily intended, revealing more frustration than she'd meant to show. She softened her tone. "But I'm sure you have studying to catch up on." The truth was more complicated. Over the past month, Patricia's phone calls had grown more frequent, her questions more pointed. Concerns about Emily living alone, suggestions about making, quote, realistic plans for the future, observations about the challenges of maintaining such a large house. Each conversation felt like preparation for something Emily couldn't quite identify, but instinctively dreaded. By 3:30, Emily had transformed her dining room into the kind of celebration space that 40 years of librarian training had made second nature. The good china emerged from the cabinet where it waited between holidays, each piece carefully inspected and polished. The silver Harold's mother had given them gleamed under the chandelier light. Fresh flowers from the garden created centerpieces that would have impressed the Millbrook Garden Club, though Emily had never bothered to join such organizations. Patricia arrived first, as Emily had known she would. At 52, her eldest daughter moved with the controlled efficiency of someone who billed clients by the minute, her BMW parked with mathematical precision in the driveway. She carried a leather portfolio along with her purse, the kind of professional accessory that seemed oddly formal for a family birthday celebration. "Mother, you look wonderful," Patricia said, her embrace carrying the measured warmth of someone performing an expected gesture. "The house is spotless as always. Though I do worry about you managing all this cleaning alone." "I manage just fine," Emily replied, though she noticed how Patricia's eyes catalogued details. The spotless floors, the perfectly arranged flowers, the complete absence of any sign that a 75-year-old woman might struggle with household maintenance. "Of course you do. But still." Patricia's smile carried the patient quality of someone indulging a child's fantasy. "We should talk about realistic expectations. But later. After we celebrate." James arrived 20 minutes behind schedule, his minivan's sliding door revealing the controlled chaos of a family with 3 children under 12. His wife Sarah managed the logistics of car seats and diaper bags with practiced efficiency, while James gathered birthday gifts and what appeared to be homemade cards from his daughters. "Sorry we're late, Mom," James said, his hug more genuine than Patricia's, but carrying an undertone of guilt that Emily had learned to associate with his visits. "Emma had a soccer game that ran over, and then we had to stop for gas, and you know how it is." Emily did know how it was. James lived 2 hours away in a suburb where his insurance adjuster salary stretched just far enough to cover the mortgage, 3 kids, expenses, and his wife's part-time teaching income. His visits came with the weight of someone trying to balance impossible obligations, and Emily had long since stopped expecting them to be relaxed affairs. Susan's arrival brought the controlled chaos that seemed to follow her everywhere. At 44, Emily's youngest daughter managed 4 children with the hypervigilant intensity of someone who had convinced herself that constant worry equaled good parenting. Her wife Rachel followed behind with the calm professionalism of someone accustomed to managing crises, though Emily noticed how Rachel's medical training made her observations more careful, more clinical. "Mom, you shouldn't have gone to all this trouble," Susan said, though her eyes swept the room with the practiced assessment of someone looking for potential hazards. "All these candles near the curtains, and the good china. What if one of the kids breaks something?" "Then we'll clean it up," Emily replied with the patience of someone who had raised 3 children and helped raise countless more during her library career. That's what children do. They make messes and learn from them. But Susan was already rearranging candles, moving breakable items to higher shelves, transforming Emily's carefully planned celebration into something safer and significantly less elegant. Rachel intervened with quiet efficiency, redirecting the children toward the books Emily had set out specifically for them, while managing to restore some of the room's original arrangement. Dinner unfolded with the careful choreography of a family gathering, where everyone understood their roles but no one felt entirely comfortable in them. Patricia dominated the conversation with updates about her law practice, her children's achievements, and veiled suggestions about Emily's need to simplify her lifestyle. James contributed periodic updates about his work, his kids, activities, and his ongoing struggles with mortgage rates and college planning. Susan provided a running commentary on child-rearing challenges, neighborhood safety concerns, and her latest anxieties about everything from food additives to online predators. Emily found herself occupying the role of appreciative audience, expected to nod and smile while her children performed their version of successful adulthood. No one asked about her volunteer work at the Literacy Center. No one inquired about the Historical Society project she'd been coordinating. No one seemed interested in her opinions about anything more substantial than whether the pot roast was too dry. The gifts followed the same pattern. Practical items chosen by people who saw her as someone whose needs had simplified to the basic requirements of elderly survival. A magnifying glass with LED light. A pill organizer with daily compartments. A medical alert bracelet that could summon help with the press of a button. Each gift came with careful explanations about its usefulness, as if Emily couldn't be trusted to understand their purpose. "These are very thoughtful," Emily said, because that's what the situation required. But she noticed how different these gifts felt from Maya's carefully wrapped package, still unopened on the kitchen counter where she'd placed it for safekeeping. As dessert plates were cleared, and the children grew restless with the adult conversation, Patricia cleared her throat in the way that signaled a prepared transition. She retrieved her leather portfolio from the side table where she'd placed it upon arrival, her movements carrying the formal precision of someone conducting business. "Before everyone leaves," Patricia said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone Emily recognized from their phone conversations, "we need to discuss some important family matters. Things we've all been thinking about but haven't had the chance to address properly." The room grew quiet in the way that preceded significant announcements. James shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Susan's expression tightened with the anxiety that seemed to be her default response to uncertainty. Rachel maintained her professional calm, but Emily caught the slight narrowing of her eyes that suggested medical training had taught her to recognize the difference between genuine concern and manufactured crisis. Emily felt something cold settle in her stomach as Patricia opened the portfolio and withdrew what appeared to be a collection of colorful brochures. The careful coordination of the evening suddenly made sense. The shared glances, the nervous energy, the way conversation had been steered away from anything that might complicate what was clearly a planned presentation. Her 75th birthday celebration was about to become something else entirely, and from the satisfied expression on Patricia's face, Emily suspected she wasn't going to like what came next. The colorful brochures Patricia spread across Emily's polished dining room table looked innocuous enough at first glance. Cheerful photographs of smiling elderly people engaged in what appeared to be fulfilling activities. But as Emily's eyes focused on the text, words like assisted living, memory care, and graduated care options began to register with the slow, horrible clarity of someone realizing they were under attack. "Now, before anyone gets upset," Patricia began, her lawyer's voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed this presentation, "we want you to know this comes from a place of love and concern. We've all been worried about you living alone in such a large house, and we think it's time to explore some options that might give us all peace of mind." Emily's fingers tightened on the edge of the table as she looked at the faces around her, her children, their spouses, even her grandchildren who had been allowed to stay for this devastating moment. The coordinated nature of their presence suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't a birthday celebration that had taken an unexpected turn. This was an intervention disguised as a family gathering. "Susan has some concerns she'd like to share," Patricia continued, nodding toward her younger sister with the kind of orchestrated smoothness that spoke of prior planning. "And James has done some research on facilities in the area that might be suitable." Susan leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her voice carrying the tremulous quality of someone who had convinced herself that emotional intensity equaled moral authority. "Mom, I've been so worried about you. Last month when I came over, you seemed confused about what day it was. And remember when you couldn't find your car keys for almost an hour? These could be early signs of cognitive decline and living alone in this big house. What if you fell? What if you had a medical emergency and no one found you for days? Emily stared at her youngest daughter, processing not just the words, but the careful ways Susan had catalogued and reframed perfectly normal moments of minor forgetfulness into evidence of declining mental capacity. The day confusion had been a simple mistake. Emily had thought it was Thursday when it was Wednesday, the kind of error anyone might make during a particularly busy week. The car keys had been in her jacket pocket, forgotten during a morning of gardening. Neither incident had felt significant at the time, but Susan had apparently filed them away as ammunition for this moment. "I'm not confused," Emily said quietly, though she could hear something dangerous building in her own voice. "I made one mistake about what day it was, and I misplaced my keys for less than an hour. That doesn't constitute cognitive decline, and it certainly doesn't justify this ambush." Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her medical training clearly warring with family loyalty. As a physician, she knew the difference between normal aging and actual cognitive impairment. But her position as Susan's wife complicated any professional assessment she might offer. James cleared his throat, his discomfort obvious in the way he avoided making eye contact with Emily while pulling a manila folder from beside his chair. "I've been looking into some of the assisted living facilities within a reasonable distance from all of us. There are some really nice places, communities where you could maintain your independence while having access to help when you need it." He spread additional brochures and printouts across the table, his insurance adjuster's training evident in the thorough research he'd conducted. Monthly costs, amenities, care level options, proximity to medical facilities. Everything had been carefully evaluated and documented. "The costs are significant," James continued, his voice taking on the apologetic tone of someone delivering unwelcome financial news. "But between your savings and the proceeds from selling the house, you could afford several years in a quality facility. And honestly, Mom, maintaining this place is getting expensive. The roof needs work, the furnace is ancient, and property taxes keep going up. It might make financial sense to downsize before these expenses become overwhelming." Emily felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest as the true scope of their planning became clear. They hadn't just researched facilities, they'd calculated the sale value of her home, analyzed her financial resources, and mapped out a future that required her to surrender both her independence and her most precious possession. "You've toured facilities," she said, her voice steady despite the emotional storm building inside her. "You've researched costs. You've calculated the value of my house, all without bothering to ask if I wanted any of this." Patricia's expression tightened slightly, revealing irritation at Emily's resistance to what she clearly viewed as reasonable planning. "We didn't want to worry you unnecessarily. We thought it would be better to present you with viable options, rather than abstract concerns." "Viable options," Emily repeated, her librarian's precision with language making the phrase sound like an obscenity. "Is that what you call disposing of your mother?" "That's not fair," Susan interjected, her voice rising with the emotional intensity that had always been her response to conflict. "We're trying to help you make responsible decisions about your future. Living alone at your age is dangerous, and this house is too much for one person to manage. We've seen what happens to elderly people who try to maintain independence too long. Accidents, falls, isolation, decline. We don't want that for you." Emily looked around the immaculate dining room, the floors she'd mopped yesterday, the windows she'd cleaned last week, the furniture she'd polished to perfection for this celebration. Every surface gleamed with the care of someone fully capable of maintaining her own home, yet her children were presenting evidence of decline she couldn't see, and decline they couldn't prove. "Have you considered," Emily said carefully, "that I might not want to move? That I might prefer to live in the home Harold built with his own hands, surrounded by 50 years of memories, maintaining the independence I've worked my entire life to preserve?" "Of course we've considered your preferences," Patricia replied, though her tone suggested these preferences were obstacles to be managed rather than wishes to be respected. "But sometimes we have to make practical decisions based on reality rather than what we'd prefer. The reality is that you're 75 years old, living alone in a house that's too large and too expensive to maintain, and showing signs of the kind of confusion that could put you in danger. The phrase, signs of confusion, hit Emily like a physical blow. In the span of 2 hours, her children had transformed her from a competent woman celebrating her birthday into a confused elderly person whose judgment couldn't be trusted. The speed and efficiency of this transformation suggested they'd been building this narrative for months, collecting evidence and coordinating their response. "What signs of confusion?" Emily demanded, her voice gaining strength as anger began to override hurt. "Forgetting what day it was once? Misplacing my keys? Do any of you want to discuss your own moments of forgetfulness? Or are those somehow different because you're not 75? James shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the logical flaws in their presentation, but unwilling to break ranks with his sisters. His discomfort was palpable as he mumbled something about it being different when patterns emerged over time. "What patterns?" Emily pressed. "I balance my own checkbook. I maintain this house. I volunteer at the Literacy Center twice a week. I coordinate the Historical Society's archive project. I drive safely. I cook for myself. I manage my own medical appointments. What patterns of decline are you seeing that I'm missing?" The silence that followed was telling. Patricia consulted her portfolio as if looking for additional evidence, while Susan's emotional certainty began to waver under the weight of Emily's systematic rebuttal. Rachel maintained her professional composure, but Emily caught the slight nod that suggested medical agreement with her self-assessment. "The point isn't whether you're managing now," Patricia said, recovering her authority. "The point is being proactive about future needs. These facilities have waiting lists. Good assisted living communities don't just accept people in crisis situations. We need to plan ahead, establish relationships, get you settled somewhere appropriate, before circumstances force less desirable options." Emily stood slowly, her movement carrying the dignified authority of someone who had spent 4 decades managing a library full of children, teenagers, and adults who all thought they knew better than she did. The familiar weight of her own power settled around her shoulders like a comfortable shawl. "I see," she said, her voice carrying the quiet steel that had once made disruptive library patrons reconsider their behavior. "You've decided that my future involves surrendering my home, my independence, and my right to make decisions about my own life. You've researched facilities, calculated costs, and coordinated this presentation. The only thing you haven't done is ask whether I agree with your assessment or want your help." She walked to the sideboard, where she kept important papers, retrieving a folder that contained her most recent bank statements, medical records from her annual physical, and the letter from her accountant, confirming her excellent financial health. The documents she spread across the table painted a picture of competency that contradicted everything her children had just presented. "My last physical showed perfect cognitive function. My blood pressure is better than most 50-year-olds. My financial advisor considers me one of his most organized clients. My house is maintained to standards that would satisfy any insurance inspector. My driving record is spotless. My volunteer supervisors consistently praise my reliability and judgment." Emily's voice grew stronger with each piece of evidence. "So I'm curious, exactly what crisis am I facing that requires this intervention?" Patricia's jaw tightened as she realized her carefully planned presentation was being systematically dismantled by someone who had clearly prepared for this possibility. "Age itself is a risk factor, Mom. Things can change quickly at your stage of life. We're trying to be responsible about planning for contingencies." "Contingencies," Emily repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "Is that what you call your mother's future? A contingency to be managed?" Susan began crying, her emotional regulation failing under the pressure of confrontation she hadn't expected. "We just want you to be safe. We want to know that someone is looking out for you, that you have help when you need it." "Is that so wrong?" Emily looked at her youngest daughter, 44 years old, married to a physician, mother of 4 children, crying because her 75-year-old mother was refusing to cooperate with plans made without her consent. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Help when I need it," Emily said quietly, "or help whether I want it or not. Because there's a significant difference between those two things." The room fell silent, except for Susan's quiet sniffling, and the ticking of the grandfather clock that had witnessed every significant conversation in this house for half a century. Emily's grandchildren sat frozen in their chairs, old enough to understand they were witnessing something important but too young to fully grasp the implications. "I think," Emily said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a decision, "you should all go home. I need time to process what you've presented and consider my options." Patricia began gathering her brochures with sharp, efficient movements that betrayed her frustration at losing control of the conversation. "We'll give you a few days to think it over, but Mom, you need to understand that we're not going to stop being concerned about your welfare just because you don't like our suggestions." Emily walked to the front door, holding it open while her children collected their belongings and rounded up their children. The September evening air carried the scent of ocean salt and dying leaves, the familiar smell of Maine autumn that she had breathed for 75 years. "Thank you for the birthday dinner," she said as they filed past her, each offering awkward hugs and promises to call soon. Only Rachel met her eyes directly, and Emily caught something in the physician's expression that looked like professional respect mixed with personal apology. As the last car pulled out of her driveway, Emily closed the door and leaned against it, allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had just occurred. Her own children had spent her 75th birthday trying to convince her that she was no longer competent to live in her own home, manage her own affairs, or make decisions about her own future. But as she walked through her perfectly maintained house, past the grandfather clock still keeping perfect time, through the kitchen where Marcus had unpacked groceries that morning with genuine care and respect, Emily realized something her children had overlooked in their careful planning. They had underestimated her completely. And that might prove to be the most expensive mistake they had ever made. The silence that settled over Emily's Victorian house after her children's departure felt different from her usual solitude. Heavier, charged with the residue of betrayal and the sharp clarity that comes from having one's worst suspicions confirmed. She moved through the familiar rooms like someone seeing them for the first time, each space now weighted with new significance. In the living room, the nursing home brochures lay scattered across her coffee table where Patricia had left them, their cheerful photographs mocking her with images of elderly people engaged in supervised activities. Emily gathered them methodically, her librarian's instincts demanding proper organization even as her emotions churned. Sunset Manor, where independence meets security. Ocean View Assisted Living, your next chapter begins here. Millbrook Care Community, family-centered senior living. The marketing language felt obscene in its manipulation. Independence that wasn't independent, security that required surrendering everything that made life worth living, family-centered care that would separate her from the community where she'd spent her entire adult life. She spread the brochures across her dining room table and began reading with the analytical precision that had made her an exceptional librarian. The costs were staggering. Even the most basic assisted living arrangements would consume her savings within 3 years. The memory care facilities, the ones Susan had circled with red ink, apparently anticipating Emily's inevitable cognitive decline, would drain her resources in 18 months. Patricia's careful calculations suddenly made sense. The house would need to be sold, not just to fund this unwanted transition, but to survive it financially. Emily walked to her study, a small room off the main hallway that Harold had helped her arrange when she'd brought work home during her final years as head librarian. Her desk contained the organized files of someone who had spent 40 years managing complex information systems, and she knew exactly where to find her financial records. The bank statements painted a picture of careful fiscal management, modest monthly expenses, strategic investments, the kind of financial stability that came from decades of living within her means while planning for the future. But as she reviewed the past 6 months of statements, Emily noticed something that made her blood run cold. Online access logs showed regular queries to her account that she hadn't made. Someone had been monitoring her financial activity, tracking her spending patterns, analyzing her assets with the thoroughness of someone preparing for a legal battle. The digital footprints led back to Patricia's law firm's IP address. Her eldest daughter hadn't just been planning this intervention for weeks or months. She'd been conducting financial surveillance, gathering evidence to support claims about Emily's declining capacity to manage her own affairs. The violation felt more intimate than if Patricia had been reading her diary. Emily's hands shook slightly as she opened her laptop. The same computer she used to manage the Historical Society's digital archives, coordinate volunteer schedules, and maintain correspondence with friends across the country. The irony wasn't lost on her that Patricia questioned her mental acuity, while Emily regularly performed tasks that would challenge people half her age. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She navigated to her bank's website and changed all her passwords, then called the customer service line to report unauthorized access to her account. The representative was polite but firm about the limitations of what they could do retroactively, though they assured her that new security measures would prevent future unauthorized access. The conversation left Emily feeling simultaneously violated and empowered. Patricia's surveillance had been a gross breach of trust, but it had also revealed the calculated nature of her children's concern. This wasn't about love or safety, it was about control and financial planning that prioritized their peace of mind over her autonomy. A soft knock at her front door interrupted her brooding. Through the lace curtains, she could see Frank Cooperson's familiar silhouette on her front porch, his posture carrying the careful concern of someone who had witnessed the evening's drama from his adjacent property. "Saw the cars leaving," Frank said when Emily opened the door, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone of someone who had spent 30 years as a high school principal navigating family crises. Seemed like it might have been a difficult conversation. Emily stepped aside to let him enter, grateful for the presence of someone who had known her as a competent adult, rather than someone to be managed. At 78, Frank moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had begun to betray him. But his mind remained sharp, and his observations astute. "They want me to sell the house and move to assisted living," Emily said without preamble, leading him into the living room where the nursing home brochures still covered her coffee table like evidence of a crime. Frank picked up one of the brochures, his expression growing grimmer as he scanned the contents. "These places cost more than most people's annual salary," he observed. "What's their reasoning?" "Apparently I'm showing signs of cognitive decline," Emily replied, her voice carrying the bitter edge of someone quoting an absurd accusation. "I forgot what day it was once last month, and I misplaced my car keys for an hour. Susan has decided these are symptoms of dementia." Frank set down the brochure and looked at Emily directly, his retired educator's assessment skills still functioning at full capacity. "Emily, I've lived next door to you for 25 years. I've watched you manage complex library systems, coordinate community projects, and maintain this house to standards that would shame people half your age. If you're showing signs of cognitive decline, then I should probably be hospitalized." The validation hit Emily harder than she'd expected. For the past 2 hours, she'd been defending her competency against her own children's assumptions, but Frank's matter-of-fact assessment reminded her that other people who interacted with her regularly, saw no evidence of decline. "They've been planning this for months," Emily continued, describing Patricia's financial surveillance and the coordinated nature of their presentation. "I thought they were concerned about my welfare, but they've been building a case to justify taking control of my life." Frank's expression darkened as he processed the implications. His own experience with aging parents had taught him to recognize the difference between genuine care and convenient solutions that prioritized adult children's comfort over elderly parents' dignity. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Emily was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving around the living room where she and Harold had celebrated 45 wedding anniversaries, where she'd hosted countless book club meetings, where 3 generations of neighborhood children had come for story time during summer vacations. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every carefully chosen decoration represented choices made over 5 decades of building a life that reflected her values and preferences. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally, her voice carrying the quiet determination that had gotten her through Harold's illness, her adjustment to widowhood, and 40 years of managing a public library with limited resources and unlimited demands. "Good," Frank said simply. "You shouldn't have to surrender your independence just because your children are anxious about theoretical future problems." After Frank left, promising to keep an eye on the house and offering to serve as a character witness if Emily needed one, she returned to her study and pulled out the business card she kept in her desk drawer. Charles Whitman had handled Harold's estate planning and had been encouraging Emily to update her own will for the past 2 years. She'd been procrastinating, partly because thinking about death seemed premature, and partly because the process would require making difficult decisions about inheritance. Now those decisions had been made for her, though not in the way her children expected. Emily opened her laptop again and began researching property transfer procedures, gift tax implications, and the legal requirements for transferring real estate ownership in Maine. The process was more complex than she'd anticipated, but not impossibly so for someone who had spent her career managing complex administrative systems. As she worked, Emily found herself thinking about Marcus Rivera, 19 years old, working 3 jobs while raising his sister and attending community college, showing more genuine care for her welfare in 2 years than her own children had demonstrated in decades. When her arthritis made opening jars difficult, Marcus noticed and began bringing easy open alternatives. When winter storms knocked down tree branches, Marcus appeared with a chainsaw before she could even call for help. When she struggled with updating her computer software, Marcus patiently walked her through the process without making her feel stupid or helpless. The contrast with her children's approach couldn't have been starker. Where Marcus saw competence and offered assistance, they saw decline and demanded control. Where Marcus respected her autonomy while providing support, they questioned her judgment while imposing their will. Emily pulled out a legal pad and began making notes, the same systematic approach she'd used to organize library budget proposals and coordinate community events. Property transfer procedures. Tax implications. Legal documentation requirements. Charles Whitman's contact information. The framework for what would either be the most generous gift of her life or the most devastating revenge, depending on perspective. By midnight, Emily had filled 6 pages with meticulous planning, her handwriting as neat and organized as it had been when she'd first learned proper penmanship 70 years ago. Her children had assumed that age had diminished her capacity for strategic thinking, but they were about to discover that 40 years of managing complex institutions had taught her skills they'd never imagined she possessed. She walked through her house one more time before bed, seeing it not just as the accumulation of 50 years of memories, but as a weapon she'd never realized she was carrying. $800,000 in equity, according to the most recent property assessment. More money than Marcus could imagine, enough to transform his and Maya's lives in ways her own children couldn't appreciate, because they'd never known financial insecurity. Her children wanted to liquidate her assets to fund their vision of appropriate aging. Instead, Emily was going to give those assets to someone who understood the difference between helping and controlling, between care and condescension, between family obligation and genuine affection. The grandfather clock chimed midnight as Emily climbed the stairs to her bedroom, each step carrying her further away from the woman who had been ambushed at her own birthday party, and closer to someone who was about to prove that underestimating a 75-year-old librarian could be a very expensive mistake. Tomorrow, she would call Charles Whitman and begin the process of rewriting her legacy in terms her children would never forget, and Marcus would never have to earn. Tonight, she would sleep better than she had in months, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a house that would soon belong to someone who appreciated what she'd built, rather than someone who saw it as an asset to be liquidated. Her children thought they were saving her from herself. Instead, they were about to discover that some people's definitions of family had nothing to do with biology, and everything to do with who showed up when it mattered most. Emily woke at dawn with the clarity that sometimes follows difficult decisions, her mind sharp and purposeful in a way she hadn't experienced since Harold's final illness had demanded similar resolve. The September morning light filtered through her bedroom curtains, illuminating dust motes that danced in patterns she'd watched for 50 years. But today, everything felt different, charged with possibility rather than weighted by routine. She dressed with particular care, choosing the navy blue dress that Harold had always said made her look distinguished, and descended to her kitchen, where the familiar ritual of coffee preparation took on ceremonial significance. Today would mark either the beginning of the most generous act of her life, or the most calculated revenge, depending on one's perspective on family obligation versus earned affection. At precisely 8 o'clock, Emily called Charles Whitman's office, knowing that 40 years of professional relationship had earned her the privilege of early morning consultations when necessary. His secretary, recognizing Emily's voice, put her through immediately. "Emily," Charles said, his voice carrying the warm familiarity of someone who had guided her through estate planning, business transactions, and the complex legal aftermath of Harold's death. "This is earlier than your usual calls. Everything all right? I need to see you today about property transfer procedures," Emily replied, her tone carrying the kind of urgency that suggested significant decisions had been made. "Specifically, I want to understand the legal requirements for gifting my house to someone who isn't family." The pause that followed was brief but telling. Charles had been encouraging Emily to update her estate planning for 2 years, but this wasn't the conversation he'd expected. "That's a significant decision with substantial tax implications," he said carefully. "Are we talking about a charitable organization or an individual?" "An individual. A young man who's shown me more genuine care and respect in 2 years than some people have shown in decades." Emily's voice carried steel beneath the diplomacy. "I want to understand my options, the legal requirements, and the timeline for such a transfer." "I can see you at 10 this morning," Charles replied, his professional instincts recognizing when a client had moved beyond preliminary consideration to active planning. "Bring any relevant documentation about the property and the intended recipient. We'll need to discuss gift tax implications, legal procedures, and timing considerations." Emily's next call was to Morrison's Hardware, where she knew Marcus would be stocking shelves before his afternoon shift at the grocery store. The elderly proprietor, Bob Morrison, had known Emily since she'd arrived in Millbrook as Harold's young bride, and he transferred her call to Marcus without question. "Mrs. Jackson?" Marcus's voice carried immediate concern. "Is everything okay? You don't usually call the store." "I'm fine, dear. But I was hoping you might have some time this afternoon to help me with a project. Nothing urgent, but I'd appreciate your input on something I'm planning." "Of course. I get off here at 2, and I don't start at the grocery until 6. Would 3 o'clock work?" Emily smiled at his immediate willingness to help, the lack of questions about inconvenience or compensation that characterized most of his interactions with her. 3 would be perfect. "And Marcus? Would you mind bringing Maya if she's available? I'd like to talk with both of you about something important." The morning flew by with the efficient productivity Emily remembered from her library management days. Her meeting with Charles had been illuminating, if complex. Gifting property worth $800,000 would trigger substantial gift tax implications, but Emily's financial resources could absorb the costs. The legal procedures were straightforward, but required careful documentation and proper timing to ensure the transfer's validity. "I have to ask," Charles had said as they reviewed the preliminary paperwork, "are you certain about this decision? Your children are going to be surprised, to put it mildly." "My children," Emily replied with the precise diction that had once made unruly library patrons reconsider their behavior, "spent yesterday evening trying to convince me that I'm no longer competent to manage my own affairs or make decisions about my future. This seems like an appropriate response to their assessment of my judgment." Charles had been Emily's lawyer long enough to recognize when further questioning would be unwelcome. He'd drawn up the preliminary documentation and scheduled the formal transfer procedures for the following week, pending Emily's final confirmation that she wanted to proceed. Marcus and Maya arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, Marcus carrying what appeared to be a small repair kit, and Maya holding a covered plate that smelled distinctly of homemade cookies. At 17, Maya Rivera possessed the kind of artistic sensibility that showed in everything, from her carefully coordinated clothing to the way she'd arranged the cookies on Emily's best china plate. "We brought you snickerdoodles," Maya announced, settling onto Emily's sofa with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been welcomed there many times. "I know they're your favorite." Emily accepted the plate with genuine pleasure, noting how Maya had remembered not just her cookie preference, but her tendency to serve refreshments on proper dinnerware rather than paper plates. The attention to detail spoke of someone who observed and cared about other people's preferences, a quality notably absent from her own children's recent interactions. "Actually," Emily said, setting the cookies aside for later, I was hoping we could talk about you too. I realize I know the basics of your situation, but I'd like to understand more about your plans, your challenges, and your dreams for the future. Marcus and Maya exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that develops between people who've navigated difficult circumstances together. Maya nodded slightly, giving Marcus permission to share their story in whatever detail he deemed appropriate. It's not very exciting. Marcus began with the self-deprecating tone Emily had come to recognize as his response to attention or praise. After our parents died, I became Maya's guardian. We inherited the apartment above the hardware store. Mom and Dad had been renting it for years, and Mr. Morrison let us stay. I work 3 jobs to cover expenses and community college tuition, and Maya handles most of the household management when I'm working. The simple recitation didn't capture the complexity Emily suspected lay beneath those basic facts. At 19, Marcus had assumed responsibility for raising a 14-year-old while grieving his own losses, managing finances that most adults would find challenging, and pursuing his education under circumstances that would have broken many people his age. "What are you studying?" Emily asked, though she suspected she already knew from their previous conversations. "Engineering. Specifically, civil engineering with a focus on sustainable infrastructure." Marcus's voice gained enthusiasm as he discussed his academic interests. "I want to design bridges and water systems that can withstand climate change impacts while serving communities that can't afford expensive solutions." Maya leaned forward, her artistic instincts engaging with the conversation. "Marcus is brilliant with math and problem solving. His professors say he could transfer to University of Maine next year if he wanted to, but the costs are prohibitive even with financial aid." Emily watched the siblings interact, noting how Maya's pride in her brother's abilities was matched by Marcus's quiet confidence in her artistic talents. When Maya mentioned her own college aspirations, graphic design with a focus on environmental communication, Marcus's face lit up with the same enthusiasm Maya had shown when discussing his engineering studies. "The challenge," Marcus continued with the practical realism Emily recognized in herself, "is balancing current necessities with future planning. Maya needs supplies for her art classes and college application fees. I need to maintain the apartment rent and utilities while saving for university transfer costs. And we both want to build some emergency savings, so we're not constantly living on the edge of financial crisis." Emily nodded, understanding the delicate mathematics of survival that governed their daily decisions. Every expense had to be weighed against competing necessities, every opportunity evaluated through the lens of what they could realistically afford. It was a kind of financial management that required more sophisticated planning skills than most adults ever developed. "What would change for you if money weren't a constraint?" Emily asked, her question seemingly hypothetical but carrying undertones that made both siblings look at her with sharpened attention. Maya answered first, her artistic imagination engaging with possibilities she'd probably never allowed herself to seriously consider. "I could focus on school instead of working part-time at the art supply store. I could apply to colleges with strong design programs instead of just the ones I can afford. I could take advanced art classes and build a portfolio that might earn scholarship opportunities." Marcus's response was characteristically practical. "I could transfer to the university engineering program next year, instead of spending 2 more years at community college. Maya could have proper art supplies instead of making do with discount materials. We could live somewhere with better heat and insulation. Most importantly, Maya could make college choices based on program quality, instead of just cost considerations." Emily listened to their answers with the satisfaction of someone whose instincts were being confirmed. Neither sibling had mentioned luxury purchases or frivolous spending. Their dreams centered on education, opportunity, and the kind of security that would allow them to plan beyond immediate survival. Modest aspirations that would require resources far beyond their current means. "There's something I want to discuss with both of you," Emily said, her tone shifting to the formal register she'd used for important library announcements. "But first, I need you to understand that what I'm about to say isn't charity, and it isn't pity. It's recognition of something valuable that deserves investment." Marcus straightened in his chair, his expression becoming cautious in the way of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. Maya leaned forward with artistic curiosity, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. "For 2 years you've shown me consistent kindness, respect, and genuine care," Emily continued, looking directly at Marcus. "You've helped with practical tasks, without making me feel helpless. You've included me in your lives without making me feel like a burden. You've treated me like family chosen rather than family assigned." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before continuing. "My biological children spent yesterday evening trying to convince me that I'm no longer competent to manage my own affairs or make decisions about my future. They presented nursing home brochures and calculated the sale value of my house to fund what they consider appropriate aging arrangements." Maya's artistic empathy immediately recognized the emotional devastation such treatment would cause, while Marcus's practical intelligence began calculating the implications for Emily's independence and dignity. "I've decided," Emily said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade, "to give them a lesson about the difference between earned and expected inheritance. I'm transferring the deed to this house to you, Marcus. Not selling it, giving it to you and Maya as recognition of the family relationship you've chosen to build with me." The silence that followed was profound. Maya's hand flew to her mouth in shocked recognition of the magnitude of Emily's announcement, while Marcus sat frozen, his mind clearly struggling to process information that challenged every assumption he'd made about his future. "Mrs. Jackson," Marcus finally whispered, his voice barely audible, "this house must be worth $800,000, according to the most recent assessment." Emily confirmed, "which means you and Maya will never have to worry about tuition, housing, art supplies, or emergency savings. It also means you'll inherit something my own children apparently don't deserve, a home where you're valued for who you are rather than what you're expected to become." Maya began crying, her artistic sensitivity overwhelming her with the emotional magnitude of Emily's gesture. Marcus remained motionless, his practical mind clearly attempting to calculate implications that extended far beyond financial mathematics. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Why would you do this? We haven't done anything to earn something so valuable." Emily smiled with the gentle patience she'd once shown to library patrons who needed help understanding complex concepts. "Marcus, you've spent 2 years treating me like family without expecting anything in return. You've respected my independence while offering genuine support. You've included me in your lives because you wanted to, not because you felt obligated to. That's exactly what someone should do to earn a place in a family legacy." She stood and moved to her desk, retrieving the legal documents Charles had prepared that morning. "I'm having a family meeting this weekend to announce my decision about the nursing home proposals. I'd like you both to be there when I explain to my children who's really been taking care of their mother, and who deserves to inherit what Harold and I built together." Marcus and Maya exchanged another glance, this one carrying the weight of lives about to be fundamentally transformed by someone else's recognition of their worth. Emily watched them process the information, seeing in their faces the same mixture of gratitude, disbelief, and overwhelming responsibility she'd felt when Harold had first proposed building their life together in this house 50 years ago. "Will you be there?" Emily asked, her question carrying the formal weight of someone extending an invitation that would change everything for everyone involved. Marcus looked at Maya, who nodded with the artistic certainty of someone who recognized a moment that would define their future. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "We'll be there." Emily smiled, feeling for the first time in months that she was moving towards something better rather than away from something valuable. Her children thought they were saving her from herself, but they were about to discover that some people's definitions of family had nothing to do with biology, and everything to do with who chose to show up when it mattered most. Word traveled through Millbrook with the efficiency that only small coastal towns could achieve, carried on the morning breeze that swept across lobster boats, and through coffee shop conversations, transformed from fact to speculation to indignant commentary before the tide changed. By Thursday morning, less than 48 hours after the Jackson family birthday intervention, Emily's situation had become the kind of community concern that prompted impromptu gatherings and strongly worded opinions, Frank Cooperson had initiated the information cascade, though not intentionally. His Wednesday morning routine included coffee at Mulligan's Diner, where he'd sat in his usual corner booth for 15 years, reading the Portland Press-Herald, while engaging in the kind of careful conversation that marked him as someone worth listening to. When Doris Mulligan had asked about the unusual number of cars at Emily's house Tuesday evening, Frank had answered with the diplomatic precision of someone who understood the difference between sharing concern and spreading gossip. Emily's children paid her a visit for her birthday, he'd said, his tone neutral enough to avoid accusations of talebearing while conveying enough disapproval to signal that something significant had occurred. Brought some reading material they thought she might find interesting. Nursing home brochures, from what I could see. The silence that had followed was the kind that preceded small-town justice. Not the legal variety, but the social reckoning that occurred when community members decided someone had crossed an important line. Doris had set down her coffee pot with the careful control of someone managing strong emotions, and 3 other regular customers had stopped their conversations to listen more carefully. Nursing homes? Betty Morrison from the post office had asked, her voice carrying the incredulity of someone who interacted with Emily twice weekly and had never noticed any signs of decline. Emily Jackson? The woman who reorganized our entire mail sorting system last month because she noticed we were losing efficiency? By Thursday afternoon, the story had evolved through multiple tellings into a more complete picture of family dynamics that painted Patricia, James, and Susan in increasingly unflattering light. Emily's reputation as a competent, independent woman who had managed complex professional responsibilities for decades served as a counter-narrative to her children's assessment of cognitive decline. Margaret Chen, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, had operated Millbrook's only bookstore for 20 years and had worked closely with Emily on literacy programs throughout that period. When Patricia had stopped by Thursday morning to pick up a special order, their conversation had taken an unexpectedly tense turn. "I heard about Emily's birthday celebration," Margaret had said, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone offering an opportunity for explanation rather than making an accusation. Must have been difficult to discuss such personal family matters. Patricia had stiffened at the implied criticism, her lawyer's instincts recognizing a hostile witness even in a bookstore conversation. Sometimes families have to make difficult decisions about aging parents. Emily's been showing signs that concern us. Signs? Margaret had responded with the sharp curiosity of someone who had observed Emily managing book orders, coordinating volunteer schedules, and balancing complex literacy program budgets with perfect accuracy. What kind of signs? Because the Emily I work with twice a week seems as sharp as she's ever been. The exchange had continued with Patricia attempting to maintain privacy while defending her family's assessment, and Margaret politely but firmly disagreeing based on her own observations. Other customers had listened with the intense attention that small-town controversies generated, and by closing time, Margaret's version of events had reached most of Millbrook's business district. Dr. Rachel Kim found herself in the most professionally complicated position as word spread about the family intervention. As Susan's wife, she was expected to support the family's concerns about Emily's welfare. As a physician who had conducted informal wellness checks on Emily for 8 years, she possessed clinical knowledge that contradicted the narrative of cognitive decline her wife was promoting. Thursday evening found Rachel in her home office, reviewing her mental notes about Emily's health status while wrestling with the ethical implications of her family connections. Emily's last informal physical exam, conducted 6 months earlier during a social visit, had revealed blood pressure numbers that would have been envied by someone 30 years younger, cognitive function tests that scored in the 95th percentile for her age group, and physical coordination that exceeded normal parameters for elderly adults. Rachel's medical training had taught her to recognize the difference between normal aging and actual cognitive impairment, and Emily exhibited none of the warning signs that would justify family intervention. The occasional forgetfulness Susan had documented could be attributed to stress, distraction, or the normal cognitive variations that affected people of all ages. The confusion about what day it was could happen to anyone managing multiple commitments and irregular schedules. More troubling, from a professional perspective, was Susan's apparent determination to interpret normal variations as symptoms of decline. Rachel had observed this pattern in other family members who were processing their own anxiety about aging parents by projecting medical problems that didn't exist. The desire to control uncertain futures sometimes manifested as medical concerns that justified taking preemptive action. Friday brought a conversation that would prove pivotal in community opinion formation. Tom Morrison, Patricia's ex-husband and someone with no immediate stake in the family drama, stopped by his former mother-in-law's house to check on her welfare after hearing multiple versions of the intervention story. His relationship with Emily had survived his divorce from Patricia, partly because he'd maintained genuine affection for her, and partly because his own parents' aging process had taught him to recognize the difference between necessary intervention and premature control. Emily received Tom's visit with the kind of careful attention she'd once given to library patrons whose research needs required diplomatic handling. She served coffee in her good china and listened while he explained his understanding of the situation, his concerns about the family dynamics, and his offer to serve as a mediator if she thought it might be helpful. "Patricia means well," Tom said with the careful diplomacy of someone maintaining relationships across a divorced family structure. "But she's been under enormous pressure at work, and her teenagers are giving her trouble. Sometimes when people feel out of control in one area of life, they try to control other areas where they think they have more influence." Emily appreciated Tom's psychological insight, while recognizing that his analysis confirmed her own assessment of Patricia's motivations. "I understand she's stressed," Emily replied. "What I don't understand is why her stress should require me to surrender my independence and move to a facility I don't want or need." Tom nodded, his business experience having taught him to recognize when someone's proposed solutions didn't match the actual problems they claimed to be addressing. "Have you considered that this might be more about Patricia's anxiety than your capabilities? She's worried about worst-case scenarios that might never occur, and she's trying to control those fears by controlling your living situation." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Tom serving as both emotional supporter and practical advisor. His perspective as someone who had navigated similar decisions with his own parents provided Emily with validation that her resistance wasn't stubbornness but reasonable self-advocacy. More importantly, Tom offered to attend the family meeting Emily had planned, serving as a neutral witness who could provide perspective on both family dynamics and practical decision-making. By Friday evening, Millbrook's informal communication network had reached consensus. Emily Jackson was being pressured to surrender her independence by children who were responding to their own anxieties rather than their mother's actual needs. The community's assessment was based on daily interactions with Emily that contradicted her children's assumptions about decline, and on recognition that competent elderly residents deserved support rather than premature institutionalization. Frank Cooperson had become Emily's unofficial advocate, sharing his observations with anyone who expressed concern about her situation. His 25-year perspective as her neighbor provided credible testimony about her continued competence, and his background as a retired educator gave him authority when discussing the difference between helping someone and controlling them. "Emily Jackson has maintained that house to standards that would satisfy any insurance inspector," he told a gathering at the community center Friday evening. "She manages complex volunteer schedules, coordinates historical society projects, and helps other elderly residents navigate Medicare paperwork. If that's cognitive decline, then most of us should be so lucky." Margaret from the bookstore had organized what she diplomatically called a wellness check. That was really a show of community support. She'd arranged for several local business owners to stop by Emily's house throughout the week with various pretexts, delivering special orders, requesting help with community projects, asking for advice about library-related matters. Each visit provided additional evidence of Emily's continued competence while demonstrating community recognition of her value as a neighbor and friend. The cumulative effect was to create a counter-narrative to her children's assessment that was based on observable behavior rather than theoretical concerns. Emily's regular interactions with multiple community members provided a comprehensive picture of someone aging successfully while maintaining independence, autonomy, and valuable community contributions. Saturday morning brought an unexpected visit that would prove crucial to the weekend's family meeting. Dr. Rachel Kim arrived at Emily's house with the careful manner of someone who had made a difficult professional decision that went against family loyalty in favor of medical ethics. "I need to speak with you about Susan's concerns," Rachel said, accepting Emily's offer of coffee while settling into the living room where the intervention had occurred 4 days earlier. As a physician, I have some observations about the medical claims that have been made regarding your cognitive status. Emily listened while Rachel explained her professional assessment of the supposed symptoms Susan had documented, her clinical judgment about the difference between normal aging and actual decline, and her opinion that the family's intervention was premature and potentially harmful. More importantly, Rachel offered to provide professional testimony at the family meeting that would contradict the medical justifications her wife had been using to support institutional placement. "This is going to cause problems in my marriage," Rachel admitted with the honesty of someone whose professional ethics were overriding personal convenience. "But I can't allow medical misinformation to be used to justify taking away someone's independence when they're clearly capable of maintaining it." The conversation lasted until noon, with Rachel providing Emily with written documentation of her medical assessment and offering to coordinate with Emily's primary care physician to obtain additional professional opinions if the family challenged her competency. By the time Rachel left, Emily had gained not just medical validation but recognition that community support extended even to family members who were willing to risk personal relationships to advocate for her welfare. Saturday afternoon found Emily in her garden, deadheading roses and preparing for the evening's confrontation with the calm satisfaction of someone who had marshaled overwhelming evidence for her position. Frank was visible in his adjacent yard, providing moral support through proximity. Margaret had stopped by with a book delivery that was really an excuse to offer encouragement. Tom had confirmed his attendance at the family meeting, and Rachel had indicated she would be present to provide medical testimony. As Emily surveyed her perfectly maintained property, she felt the quiet confidence that came from understanding her own worth, and having that worth recognized by people whose judgment she respected. Her children had spent months building a case for her incompetence, based on theoretical concerns and projected anxieties. The community had spent the same period observing her actual capabilities and arriving at very different conclusions. The family meeting scheduled for 7 o'clock would force a confrontation between these competing assessments, with Emily's independence hanging in the balance. But as she prepared for the evening's battle, Emily realized she was no longer fighting alone. Millbrook had chosen sides, and the community had chosen her. By 6:30, Marcus and Maya had arrived as requested, both carrying the nervous energy of people about to witness something significant. Emily had prepared her living room like a courtroom, with chairs arranged to accommodate family members, community witnesses, and the young man who would soon learn he was inheriting more than a house. He was inheriting recognition as someone worthy of trust, respect, and investment in his future. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times as car doors began slamming in Emily's driveway, signaling the arrival of children who thought they were coming to collect their mother's surrender. Instead, they were about to discover that underestimating Emily Jackson had been the most expensive mistake of their lives. Marcus's hand trembled slightly as he climbed the familiar porch steps, but not from nervousness about the loose board he'd repaired months ago. Emily had called yesterday with an invitation that felt more like a summons. "I need you here tomorrow at 2 o'clock. There's something important I want to discuss with the family, and I'd like you present." He'd tried to decline, sensing the weight of family business that wasn't his to witness. But Emily's tone had brooked no argument. "Marcus, trust me on this. You belong here." Now standing before the oak door he'd helped her oil and polish just last week, he wondered what role he was meant to play in whatever drama was about to unfold. Through the lace curtains, he could see Patricia pacing the living room with the restless energy of a caged attorney, while James sat rigidly in David's old armchair, his knuckles white against the upholstered arms. Emily answered his knock before he could raise his hand a second time. She looked different today, not older or frailer, but somehow more substantial, as if she'd gathered all her scattered energy into a single focused point of light. "Marcus. Right on time." Her smile carried a warmth that seemed to encompass secrets. "Come in. I believe you know everyone." The living room felt charged with the particular tension that preceded family explosions. Patricia wore her courtroom face, professionally pleasant but with steel underneath. Susan twisted a tissue in her hands, her anxiety manifesting in jerky movements and darting glances. James looked like a man attending his own execution, resigned but dreading the moment the axe would fall. Dr. Rachel Kim sat slightly apart from the family cluster, her medical training evident in the way she observed without appearing to judge. She nodded to Marcus with professional courtesy, but her eyes held questions about his presence in what was clearly a family crisis. "Please sit." Emily directed Marcus to the sofa, positioning him directly across from her children. The arrangement felt deliberate, as if she were staging a tableau for maximum impact. Patricia cleared her throat with lawyerly precision. "Mother, I hope you've had time to consider our discussion from last week. We only want what's best for you." "Oh, I've considered it extensively," Emily replied, her voice carrying a crystalline clarity that made Marcus shift uncomfortably. Something was about to happen, something that would change everything, and he was trapped in the center of it. Emily rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to the antique secretary desk that had belonged to her grandmother. From its locked drawer, she withdrew a manila folder thick with official documents. "Patricia, you mentioned that I needed to make some decisions about my future. You were absolutely right." Emily's fingers traced the folder's edge as she returned to her seat. "So I've made them." Marcus watched the color drain from James's face, while Susan's tissue twisting accelerated to frantic levels. Patricia's professional composure never wavered, but her eyes sharpened with the predatory focus of someone sensing either victory or disaster. "I'm glad you're being reasonable," Patricia began, but Emily raised a hand that commanded immediate silence. "I want to tell you all a story first," Emily continued, her gaze moving deliberately from face to face before settling on Marcus with unexpected tenderness. 2 years ago, I was struggling with grocery bags that had grown mysteriously heavier with age. A young man appeared at my elbow, not asking if I needed help, not making a show of his assistance, just quietly taking the bags and walking with me to my car. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. This wasn't the story he'd expected to be told in front of Emily's children, whose expressions ranged from polite interest to barely concealed impatience. "That was the beginning," Emily said, "not of charity or obligation, but of something I'd forgotten could exist between people who aren't bound by blood. Respect, genuine care, the kind of attention that sees a person rather than a problem to be managed." Susan leaned forward with desperate intensity. "Mother, we care about you. That's why we're here." "Are you?" Emily's question hung in the air like a blade. "Or are you here because my independence has become inconvenient? Because your inheritance might be at risk if I make the wrong decision about my living arrangements?" The accusation hit its target with surgical precision. Patricia's professional mask slipped for just an instant, revealing something raw and defensive underneath. James actually flinched as if Emily had struck him physically. "That's not fair," Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "We're trying to protect you from making decisions you might regret when your judgment isn't as sharp as it once was." Marcus felt the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. Emily's eyes glittered with a fury he'd never seen before, transforming her from gentle grandmother into something formidable and potentially dangerous. "My judgment," Emily repeated slowly, as if tasting each word. "You question my judgment while simultaneously asking me to trust yours about the most intimate aspects of my life. You want me to abandon the home where I've lived for 50 years, surrender my independence, and place my future in the hands of people who visit me once a month, and call my self-sufficiency a safety risk." She stood again, the manila folder clutched against her chest like armor. "So I've made a judgment call. About family. About who deserves what. About the difference between loving someone and merely tolerating the obligation to care for them." Marcus felt the world tilt sideways as Emily's attention focused on him with laser intensity. "Marcus, for 2 years you've shown up. Not when it was convenient, not when you had nothing better to do, but when I needed you. You've repaired my house, helped with technology I couldn't master, driven me to appointments when the weather was too dangerous for an old woman to navigate alone. You've done this without being asked, without expecting payment, without treating me like a burden to be managed." "Mrs. Jackson," Marcus began, but she silenced him with a gentle gesture. "More than that, you've treated me like a person whose opinions matter, whose stories are worth hearing, whose independence deserves respect rather than elimination. You've included me in your life, told me about Maya's college applications, shared your struggles with work and school, asked for my advice about decisions that had nothing to do with my usefulness to you." Patricia was on her feet now, every instinct screaming danger. "Mother, what are you saying?" Emily opened the manila folder with ceremonial deliberation, withdrawing a thick sheaf of legal documents bound with blue ribbon. Marcus recognized the format from his brief stint working at the courthouse. Property transfer papers, official and irrevocable. "I'm saying that family isn't defined by genetics or legal obligation. It's defined by choice. By the daily decision to show up, pay attention, and treat each other with dignity, even when it's inconvenient." She extended the documents toward Marcus, whose hands remained frozen at his sides as the full implications crashed over him like a tsunami. "This is the deed to my house and property, legally transferred to Marcus Rivera and his sister Maya Rivera, effective immediately. The transfer includes the house, the 2-acre lot, and all improvements, with an assessed value of $800,000. The silence that followed was so complete Marcus could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, the distant cry of seagulls over the harbor, the sound of his own heart hammering against his ribs. Susan's voice came out as barely a whisper. "You're giving away our inheritance." "I'm giving my home to people who understand what it means to be family," Emily corrected with gentle firmness. "People who chose to love me without expecting anything in return." Patricia's professional composure finally shattered completely. "This is insane. You can't just— Marcus is a stranger. He's a child. You're having some kind of episode." "I'm having an episode of clarity," Emily replied, still holding the documents toward Marcus, who seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what was happening. "Take them, Marcus. This house should belong to someone who sees it as a home rather than an asset." Marcus found his voice at last, though it came out hoarse with emotion. "Mrs. Jackson, I can't. This is too much. Your family—" "My family," Emily's voice carried absolute finality, "consists of people who show up when it matters. Who see me as Emily, rather than as an obstacle to their financial security. Who trust my judgment enough to let me make my own decisions about how I want to live and die." She placed the deed in Marcus's nerveless fingers, closing his hands around the documents with her own weathered palms. "You and Maya are my family now. You chose to be every day for 2 years, without contracts or legal obligations or expectations of reward. That makes you more my children than 3 people who share my DNA but treat me like an expired warranty on a piece of furniture they're ready to replace." Patricia was moving toward the phone, her lawyer's instincts finally kicking into action. "I'm calling Dr. Morrison. This is clearly a mental health crisis. No rational person gives away an $800,000 property to a teenager they've known for 2 years." "Call whoever you want," Emily said calmly. "I've already had a complete psychological evaluation. Dr. Morris confirmed my mental competency yesterday, as did my attorney, who supervised the document preparation. Everything is legal, binding, and irrevocable." The documents felt impossibly heavy in Marcus's hands, not just paper and ink, but the weight of a life's work, of decades of love and labor, of trust beyond anything he'd ever imagined receiving. "Mrs. Jackson," he said, tears making his voice thick, "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll take care of it," Emily replied. "Say you'll see it as a home rather than an investment. Say you'll remember that love is something you choose to do, not something that happens to you because of accident of birth." Around them, Emily's biological children stood in various stages of shock and fury, but Marcus could only see the woman who just entrusted him with everything she owned because he'd bothered to treat her with the respect every human being deserved. "I promise," he whispered, and meant it with every cell in his body. Emily smiled, and for the first time in months, she looked completely at peace. The courthouse steps felt different under Emily's feet as she descended them that Tuesday morning in late October. 3 weeks had passed since Judge Morrison, no relation to her former son-in-law, had delivered his verdict with the weight of Solomon's wisdom. Mrs. Jackson demonstrates complete mental competency and retains full legal authority over her property. The deed transfer to Marcus Rivera is valid and binding. Patricia had sat rigid in the gallery, her lawyer's composure cracking like ice on a warming pond. The sound she'd made when the gavel fell wasn't quite a sob, but it carried the same hollow ache. Emily had turned to look at her eldest daughter then, hoping to see some recognition, some understanding of what had truly been decided in that courtroom. Instead, Patricia's eyes held only the cold calculation of someone already planning her next move. "Mrs. Jackson," Marcus had whispered beside her, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I still can't believe." "Believe it," Emily had said, placing her weathered hand over his young one, "and more importantly, deserve it." Now, walking through downtown Millbrook toward the library where she'd volunteered for 2 hours every Tuesday since her retirement, Emily felt the weight of victory settling into her bones. It was heavier than she'd expected, this vindication. Justice, she was learning, didn't always feel like triumph. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the distant salt of the harbor. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop waved from across the street, her smile wider than usual. Word traveled fast in Millbrook, and the court's decision had been the talk of every coffee shop and grocery store checkout line for days. "Emily!" Dr. Rachel Kim's voice called from behind her. Emily turned to see Susan's wife approaching with the measured gait of someone who'd been wrestling with difficult thoughts. Rachel's usually composed features showed traces of sleepless nights. "Rachel," Emily said, stopping beside the bronze memorial fountain that marked the town center, "how are you holding up?" "I should be asking you that." Rachel's medical training had taught her to observe, and what she saw in Emily's face wasn't the simple satisfaction of a woman who'd gotten her way. This couldn't have been easy. Emily studied the younger woman's face. Rachel had been caught in an impossible position, her professional assessment conflicting with her wife's emotional demands. The competency evaluation had forced her to testify about Emily's mental acuity, essentially contradicting Susan's claims about declining faculties. "You did the right thing," Emily said quietly, "telling the truth, even when it wasn't what your family wanted to hear." Rachel's laugh held no humor. "The right thing seems to have a high cost these days. Susan isn't speaking to me. She thinks I betrayed her by not finding some way to support her concerns about you." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the fountain's water catch the morning sunlight. "James." Emily wiped her hands on her gardening apron. "We weren't expecting you." "I was in the area." It was a polite fiction. James lived 2 hours away, but Emily didn't challenge it. "I brought something for you." He extended the package, and Emily accepted it with curious hands. Inside was a small photo album, bound in soft blue leather. The first page held a picture she hadn't seen in years. Herself at 35, laughing as James, then 8 years old, presented her with a bouquet of dandelions he'd picked from their yard. "I found it when I was cleaning out some boxes," James said, his voice careful. "I thought you might like to have it." Emily turned the pages slowly. Here was her life in fragments: birthday parties and Christmas mornings, school plays and graduation ceremonies, her children at various ages beaming or sulking, or caught in moments of unguarded joy, her husband in his prime, building the garden shed, teaching Patricia to ride a bike, carrying a sleeping Susan up to bed. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Maya leaned over to look, her expression soft with interest. "You were beautiful," she said simply. "You still are, but in the pictures, you look so happy." "I was happy," Emily replied, surprised by the truth of it. She'd been so focused on the pain of recent months that she'd forgotten the genuine joy those photographs represented. "We had good times." "We did," James agreed quietly. "I've been remembering that lately." They stood in awkward silence, the weight of unspoken apologies and explanations hanging between them. Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. "Maya and I were going to walk down to the harbor," he said. "Check on the boats coming in." "You don't have to," Emily began. "We want to," Maya said firmly. "Besides, I promised Mrs. Henderson I'd stop by the flower shop. She's teaching me about arranging." As the young people left, Emily felt both grateful for their tact and nervous about being alone with James. Their last few conversations had been stilted affairs, both of them trying to navigate the new landscape of their relationship. "The garden looks good," James said finally. "Dad would have liked seeing it cared for." "Marcus has a natural touch with plants," Emily replied. And Maya sees possibilities I would never notice. She suggested the herb spiral by the back fence. I thought it was too ambitious, but she was right. James studied the carefully constructed spiral of stones and soil, planted with basil and thyme and rosemary. It was both functional and beautiful, the kind of project that required vision and patience. She's going to art school in the fall, he said. Yes, the Maine College of Art. She's incredibly talented. That's expensive. Emily's spine straightened at the implication in his tone. I'm helping with costs. It's my choice what to do with my money. I wasn't criticizing, James said quickly. I was. It's generous of you. They're lucky to have you. The admission hung between them, carrying weight neither of them wanted to examine too closely. Emily set the photo album on the porch table and settled into one of the wicker chairs her husband had bought for their 30th anniversary. How are Patricia and Susan? She asked. James's expression darkened. Patricia's still angry. She hired another lawyer to look into the deed transfer, but he told her the same thing the first one did. It's legally solid. She's talking about selling her condo, downsizing her lifestyle. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? The question was asked without malice, but with genuine curiosity. Emily considered it carefully. I'm sorry she's struggling, she said finally. I'm not sorry she can't count on inheriting my house to solve her problems. Those are different things. James nodded slowly. It's been hard on her marriage. Rachel testified that you were competent, and Susan took it as betrayal. They're in counseling. Rachel did her job, she told the truth. I know. I tried to explain that to Susan, but she's not ready to hear it. James sank into the chair beside her. She keeps asking why you didn't trust us enough to let us help you. Emily remembered when they dedicated this memorial after the war, how the whole town had gathered to honor their fallen. Family had meant something different then, when loss made you hold tighter to those who remained. She loves you, Emily said finally. Susan, I mean. She's frightened and confused, and she's taking that out on the people closest to her. But she loves you. The way she loved you when she was pushing for the nursing home? The question hung between them like morning mist. Emily had been asking herself the same thing for weeks. Was what her children felt for her truly love? Or was it something else wearing love's mask? I think, Emily said slowly, that love without respect becomes something else entirely. Something that looks like care, but feels like control. Rachel nodded, her medical mind processing this diagnosis of family dysfunction. Susan genuinely believed she was protecting you. The anxiety has gotten worse since her neighbor's fall. She sees danger everywhere now. Fear makes us cruel sometimes, Emily said, even when we don't mean to be. They parted ways at the library steps, Rachel heading to her practice, Emily entering the familiar sanctuary of books and stories. Inside, she found Marcus reshelving returns in the children's section, his movements careful and reverent among the picture books that had shaped generations of Millbrook children. You don't have to help here, Emily said, approaching with a cart of new acquisitions. You've got enough on your plate with school and work. Marcus looked up from a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are, his expression serious. This place matters to you. That makes it matter to me. The simple statement hit Emily with unexpected force. When had her own children stopped caring about what mattered to her? When had their conversations become solely about what mattered to them? Your sister called this morning, Emily said, settling into her usual chair behind the reference desk. Maya's college applications are due soon. She's been working on her essays every night after homework. Pride and worry warred in Marcus's voice. The art portfolio is incredible, but the tuition... We'll figure it out, Emily said, the word we carrying weight neither of them had fully processed yet. This was what family looked like now. Shared burdens, shared hopes, shared determination to see each other succeed. The morning passed quietly, punctuated by the usual rhythm of library life. Mrs. Patterson returned her mystery novels and selected new ones, commenting appreciatively on Marcus's helpful recommendations. Two mothers brought their toddlers for story time, and Emily watched Marcus interact with the children with natural ease, remembering their names and favorite books. This was what Patricia and Susan and James couldn't see: the life she'd built, the community that valued her, the young man who'd become family not through obligation but through choice. They saw only decline and danger, missing the vibrant connections that made her days meaningful. Around noon, James appeared in the library doorway, his posture uncertain. Emily felt her chest tighten. Of her 3 children, James had always been the most likely to bridge the gap, but also the least likely to take a firm stand. He approached the desk with the hesitant gait of someone walking through a minefield. "Mom," he said, the word carrying months of accumulated weight. "James." She didn't rise from her chair, didn't make this easier for him. "Have you come to check on my mental competency yourself?" His flinch told her the barb had hit home. "I deserved that. We all did." Marcus moved quietly toward the back of the library, giving them privacy while remaining close enough to intervene if needed. Emily appreciated his protective instincts even as she hoped they wouldn't be necessary. "The court decision," James continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Patricia's taking it hard. She keeps saying there has to be something wrong with the evaluation, some way to appeal." "And you?" James pulled out a chair and sat across from her, looking older than his 48 years. "I keep thinking about when Dad got sick. How you cared for him at home until the very end, even when the doctors said institutional care would be easier. You never gave up on him having dignity." Emily's throat constricted. Her husband's battle with Alzheimer's had been brutal, watching the brilliant man she'd loved disappear piece by piece. But she'd fought to preserve his humanity even as his mind failed, reading to him from books he'd once discussed with passion, playing music he'd hummed while working in the garden. "He died in his own bed," she said. "In the room where we'd loved each other for 45 years. And we wanted to put you away the moment you turned 75 and had a birthday." James's laugh was bitter. "What does that say about us?" "It says you're scared," Emily replied. "And that's understandable. But being scared doesn't give you the right to make my choices for me." They sat in silence, the afternoon light streaming through the library's tall windows, casting geometric patterns on the worn wooden floors. Emily could hear Marcus humming softly in the poetry section, a sound that had become as familiar and comforting as her morning coffee. "The house," James said finally. "Marcus seems like a good kid, but Mom, that's our family home. Where we grew up, where your father and I built a life together." Emily finished. "And where I'm still building one. Just because he's gone doesn't mean my life ended." James flinched again. "We never said it did, didn't you? When you assumed I couldn't manage my own finances? When you decided I was too frail to live alone? When you presented nursing home brochures instead of asking what I actually needed?" Emily's voice remained calm, but steel ran underneath. "You treated me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be consulted. We were trying to help." "No," Emily said firmly. "You were trying to manage me. There's a difference." Marcus appeared at her shoulder with a steaming cup of tea, prepared exactly as she liked it. He set it down without a word, his presence a quiet reminder of what actual attentiveness looked like. James watched this small interaction, and Emily saw recognition dawn in his eyes. This young man, barely older than his own eldest son, had observed and remembered such a simple preference. When had James last noticed how his mother took her tea? "He really loves you," James said, his voice wondering. "He chose to," Emily replied. "That's what makes it real." As James left, promising to visit again soon but making no commitments beyond that tentative gesture, Emily felt the strange mixture of grief and relief that had become familiar. She'd gained a family that valued her, but lost the one she'd been born to raise. The victory felt hollow in some ways, complete in others. That evening, as she and Marcus prepared dinner in the kitchen where she'd fed her children thousands of meals, Emily found herself thinking about legacy, not the financial inheritance her biological children had coveted, but the deeper legacy of values and love passed between generations. Maya showed me her essay about you, Marcus said, stirring sauce for the pasta. The one for her college applications. Oh, she wrote about how you taught her that family isn't just biology, that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who choose you. He paused, his young face serious. She's right, you know. You chose us when you didn't have to, when it cost you everything else. Emily set down her wine glass and looked at this young man who'd somehow become the son she'd needed without knowing it. The cost had been high. 3 biological children who might never understand what they'd lost when they decided to see her as a burden instead of a person. But the gain had been immeasurable. No, she said softly. It cost me what I thought I had, but it gave me what I actually needed. Outside, the October wind rustled through the maple tree her husband had planted the year James was born. Soon the leaves would fall, covering the ground with gold and red, and Emily would rake them with Marcus's help, continuing the seasonal rhythms that made a house into a home. The legal battle was over. Emily felt a familiar flash of anger. Help me what? Live the life you thought I should live? Make the decisions you thought I should make? That's not help, James. That's control. But we were worried. You were worried about yourselves. Emily cut him off, her voice sharp with months of suppressed frustration. Worried about what people would think if something happened to me while I was living alone. Worried about the financial burden if I needed care. Worried about the inconvenience of having to actually check on me regularly instead of just calling once a week to ease your guilt. James recoiled as if she'd slapped him. That's not fair. Isn't it? When was the last time any of you visited just to spend time with me? Not to check up on me, not to discuss my situation, but just because you enjoyed my company? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of bees working Emily's flowering shrubs and the distant call of gulls from the harbor. I don't remember, James admitted finally. Neither do I. They sat without speaking, the truth settling around them like dust after an explosion. Emily could see tears gathering in James's eyes and felt her anger begin to ebb. She'd spoken harshly, but not dishonestly. I miss him, James said suddenly. Dad, I know you do too, but he was the bridge between us. He knew how to talk to you, how to make you laugh. Without him, I feel like I don't know how to be your son anymore. The admission broke something loose in Emily's chest. Her husband had been the family translator, smoothing over conflicts and finding common ground. Without his gentle mediation, they'd all reverted to their worst instincts. Her children becoming controlling, Emily becoming defensive. Your father would have hated what happened, she said softly. The nursing home ultimatum, the legal battle, all of it. I know. James wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He always said you were the strongest person he knew. He'd be ashamed of us for treating you like you were fragile. Emily reached over and took her son's hand, feeling how soft it had become from his office job. Her husband's hands had been calloused from building and fixing and creating. Marcus's hands were developing the same roughness from his various jobs and his work around her house. You can still learn, she said. It's not too late to be the son he raised you to be. James squeezed her fingers. I'd like to try. If you'll let me. What would that look like? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden where the tomato plants were already showing their first small blossoms. I don't know exactly. Maybe visiting more often, without an agenda. Maybe asking what you need instead of assuming I know. Maybe, he paused, his voice growing stronger. Maybe getting to know Marcus and Maya. If they're your family now, I should know them too. Emily felt tears prick her own eyes. It was more than she'd dared hope for from any of her biological children. They're good people, she said. You'd like them if you gave yourself the chance. Marcus seems devoted to you, and Maya. She looks at you the way Patricia used to when she was small, before life made her so hard. Patricia wasn't born hard, Emily said carefully. She learned to be that way. Success in her field requires a certain ruthlessness. and I think she forgot how to turn it off when she came home. Do you think... Would you ever want to see her again? Emily considered the question. Her eldest daughter's face during the court proceedings haunted her, not just angry, but genuinely baffled by Emily's choices. Patricia had convinced herself that her control was love, her management was care. Breaking through that self-deception would require more than Patricia was probably capable of. If she could accept that this is my life and these are my choices, then yes, Emily said finally. But I won't be managed or handled or treated like a problem to be solved. Not by her, not by anyone. I'll talk to her. Don't. If she wants to rebuild our relationship, it has to be her decision. Her genuine decision, not her obligation or your persuasion. James nodded reluctantly. They could hear Marcus and Maya returning, their voices bright with shared laughter over some private joke. Emily felt her heart lift at the sound. Young people should laugh like that, free and unguarded. They sound happy, James observed. They are. They've had hard lives, but they haven't let it make them bitter. Maya especially. She's lost so much, but she still finds wonder in small things. Yesterday she spent an hour photographing the way light fell through the kitchen curtains. She sounds like an artist. She is. A real one. She sees the world differently than the rest of us. Marcus and Maya appeared around the side of the house, Maya carrying a small bouquet of daffodils from Mrs. Henderson's shop. She approached Emily with the shy smile she still wore when offering gifts. Mrs. Henderson said these are the first of the season, she said, presenting the flowers. She wanted you to have them. They're beautiful, Emily said, accepting the bouquet. Did you tell her about your acceptance letter? Maya's smile widened. She hugged me so hard I thought she might crack a rib. Then she made me promise to bring her some of my artwork when I come home for visits. Home, Emily repeated softly, savoring the word. Maya had begun using it naturally, unself-consciously, to refer to Emily's house. Their house, now. James watched this interaction with growing understanding. This wasn't manipulation or strategy. It was genuine affection, freely given and received. Emily wasn't being charmed by clever young people angling for inheritance. She was being loved by a family she'd chosen, who had chosen her in return. Maya, James said carefully, Emily tells me you're interested in photography. Maya's eyes lit up with the particular fire that came when someone mentioned her passion. I love capturing moments that people might miss otherwise. The way morning light hits dewdrops, or how someone's face changes when they're listening to music they love. I'd like to see some of your work sometime, if you'd be willing to share it. Maya glanced at Emily, seeking permission or perhaps reassurance. Emily nodded encouragingly. I have a portfolio on my tablet, Maya said. Marcus upgraded it for me last Christmas so I could store more images. As Maya pulled up her digital portfolio, Emily watched James's face change. The young woman's work was sophisticated beyond her years, showing not just technical skill, but genuine artistic vision. She'd captured moments of beauty in everyday life. An elderly man feeding pigeons, children playing in puddles, the weathered hands of fishermen mending nets. These are remarkable, James said, and his admiration was clearly genuine. You have a real gift, Maya beamed under the praise. Emily's been helping me understand composition theory. She knows so much about visual arts from her work at the library. She always was the smart one in the family, James said, looking at his mother with something approaching awe. I forget sometimes that you have interests beyond worrying about us. I have a whole life beyond worrying about you, Emily corrected gently. I always did. You just weren't paying attention. The afternoon stretched on, conversation flowing more easily than it had in years. Marcus shared stories from his engineering classes, Maya discussed her plans for college, and James talked about his children with genuine pride, rather than obligatory updates. Emily found herself relaxing in ways she'd forgotten were possible around her biological family. When James finally rose to leave, the sun was beginning to set behind the harbor, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Thank you, he said to Emily, for today. For the second chance. For, he gestured helplessly at the garden, the house, the life she'd built. For showing me what I was too blind to see before. Just don't be blind going forward, Emily replied. That's all I ask. As his car disappeared down the street, Maya slipped her arm through Emily's. He seems nice, she said diplomatically. He's trying to be better, Emily said. That counts for something. Do you think his sisters will come around too? Emily considered the question as they walked back toward the house. Through the kitchen windows, she could see Marcus starting dinner preparations, moving around her kitchen with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged there. I hope so, she said finally, but I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left waiting for them to figure out what they lost. That night, as the three of them sat around the dinner table sharing the day's events, Emily felt the peculiar satisfaction that comes from difficult growth. The conversation with James hadn't erased months of hurt, but it had opened a door that had seemed permanently closed. Whether he would prove capable of walking through it remained to be seen, but the possibility existed. Mrs. Patterson called while you were outside, Marcus said, passing Emily the salad bowl. The book club wants to discuss The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo next month. She said you'd appreciate the themes of chosen family. Emily laughed, recognizing Mrs. Patterson's not-so-subtle editorial commentary. She's not wrong, though I suspect she mainly wants to argue about whether the ending is satisfying. Is it? Maya asked. That depends, Emily replied, on whether you believe people can reinvent themselves at any stage of life. She looked around the table at these 2 young people who had become her family through choice rather than chance, thinking about James's tentative overtures and her own capacity for forgiveness. The ending to her story was still being written, but for the first time in months, she felt hopeful about the chapters yet to come. Outside, spring continued its quiet work of renewal, and inside, 3 people who had found each other across the gaps of age and circumstance continued building something that looked remarkably like home. The morning of Millbrook's annual summer festival dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made Emily grateful to be alive in a place where the ocean met the sky in an endless line of possibility. She stood at her bedroom window, watching Marcus and Maya set up folding chairs on their front lawn, the best vantage point for the parade that would wind through downtown before ending at Harbor Park. At 75 years and 4 months old, Emily Jackson had never felt more certain of who she was or where she belonged. Emily! Maya's voice drifted up from the garden. The banner looks perfect? Emily smiled, remembering Maya's excitement when she'd suggested creating a sign for their little viewing party. The banner read, "Home is where love lives," in Maya's elegant script, decorated with watercolor flowers that seemed to dance in the morning breeze. It was both beautiful and declarative, a public statement about the family they'd built. Downstairs, Marcus was arranging a pitcher of lemonade and plates of the cookies Emily had taught him to make from her mother's recipe. The sight of his careful attention to hospitality filled her with pride. He'd grown into the role of son with natural grace, taking on responsibilities without being asked, caring for their home as if he'd been born to it. "Frank's coming over early," Marcus said as Emily entered the kitchen, "and Mrs. Patterson said she might stop by with her granddaughter. And James? He called this morning. He'll be here around 10 with Sarah and the kids." Emily nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of hope and caution that James's visit still inspired. Over the past few months, he'd proven surprisingly consistent in his efforts to rebuild their relationship. His children, Emily's grandchildren, had begun to warm to her as well, once they realized she wasn't the frail, confused woman their father had initially described. The first cars began arriving before 9, neighbors and friends gathering on blankets and lawn chairs along the parade route. Emily had lived through 53 of these festivals, but this year felt different. This year, she wasn't just a spectator watching from the sidelines of community life. She was part of something larger, connected to the ongoing story of Millbrook through the young people who'd become her family. Mrs. Jackson. Dr. Rachel Kim approached from across the street, Susan close behind. Emily's breath caught. She hadn't seen her youngest daughter since the court proceedings 8 months ago. Susan looked older, more fragile somehow, but her eyes held something Emily hadn't seen there in years. Uncertainty that might be the beginning of humility. "Hello, Susan," Emily said carefully. Mom. The word came out rough, as if Susan hadn't used it in a long time. Rachel thought, we wondered if we might watch the parade with you. If that's all right. Emily felt Marcus and Maya tense slightly behind her, ready to support her decision, whatever it might be. The protective instinct they'd developed for her was touching, but this choice had to be hers alone. Are you here to tell me what's best for me? Emily asked quietly. Or are you here because you want to spend time with me? Susan's face crumpled slightly. Because I miss you. Because I've been going to counseling and I'm starting to understand that maybe I was wrong about some things. Maybe? I was wrong, Susan said more firmly. About the nursing home. About thinking I knew better than you what you needed. About not trusting you to make your own choices. She glanced at Marcus and Maya, then back to Emily. About not seeing that you were building something beautiful here. Emily studied her daughter's face, looking for signs of manipulation or strategy. Instead, she saw genuine remorse and something that looked like wonder, as Susan took in the scene around them. Neighbors calling out greetings, Maya's banner fluttering in the breeze, Marcus offering lemonade to anyone who wanted it. You can stay, Emily said finally, but this is my family now, all of us. If you can't accept that, you should leave. I understand, Susan said, and I'd like to meet them properly, if they're willing. The morning unfolded with careful grace, old relationships tentatively reconnecting, while new ones deepened. Susan proved surprisingly easy with Maya, admiring her artistic eye and listening with genuine interest as the young woman described her college plans. With Marcus, she was more hesitant, but Emily watched her begin to see what had drawn Emily to him, his kindness, his maturity, his obvious devotion to the woman who'd become his chosen mother. When the parade began, Emily found herself surrounded by family both old and new. James sat beside her with his children, while Susan and Rachel claimed spots on the blanket Maya had spread on the grass. Marcus moved between groups, ensuring everyone had what they needed, playing the role of host with natural grace. As the high school marching band passed by, playing a slightly off-key version of Stars and Stripes Forever, Emily felt a hand slip into hers. Maya had moved closer, settling beside her chair with the comfortable familiarity of a daughter who belonged there. Thank you, Maya said softly, her words nearly lost in the music and cheering. For what? For showing me that family can be something you choose, something you build, something that makes you better than you were before. Emily squeezed the young woman's hand, thinking about legacy and love, and the strange paths that bring people together. The house she'd signed over to Marcus would shelter and nurture him and Maya for decades to come. But more than that, the model of chosen family they'd created together would ripple outward, influencing how they approached relationships for the rest of their lives. As the festival continued around them, Emily Jackson sat surrounded by the people who'd chosen to love her, confident at last that she'd found her way to where she belonged. The new legacy she was building had nothing to do with property or inheritance, and everything to do with the radical act of choosing love over obligation, respect over control, and authentic connection over empty duty. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of family story worth leaving behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,